Kalira Miller, and this is a company financial analysis. This covers 3 different industries, 5 companies from each industry, and 15 companies overall. The industries were home improvement. They had Home Depot, Lowe's, Beacon Roofing, Tile Shop, and Flooring and Decor. Automotive parts retailers was the second industry, with Advance, AutoZone, U.S. Auto Parts, AutoNation, and O'Reilly's. The last industry was cosmetics and skincare. They had Cody Cosmetics, New Skin, Johnson & Johnson, Revlon, and Estee Lauder. For the home improvement ratios, the liquidity, Home Depot had the highest overall. Even though it's been declining over the past 5 years, it's still high and healthy. Beacon Roofing has the highest quick ratio at 108. Tile Shop usually has the highest current ratio. Tile Shop, Beacon, and Home Depot all are above the industry average, which is 1.49. And Lowe's has the lowest liquidity ratios compared to all its peers at 1.0. And that has been for the past 5 years. For solvency, Beacon Roofing has the lowest leverage ratio, which we really like, at 2.11. And it's maintained that over time for the past 5 years. The industry average was 3.99. Tile Shop, Beacon, and Flooring are all below the industry average. Home Depot has the highest equity multiplier at 8.03, and it was the highest for all years. It also had the highest tie ratio, 13.89, and that was for most years compared. Home Depot and Lowe's both have equity multipliers above the industry average, so they're highly leveraged. Tile Shop and Home Depot both have tie ratios above the industry average, and Flooring and Decor has the lowest tie ratio overall, and it's been that way for the past 5 years. So for asset efficiency, Home Depot consistently has the highest total asset turnover. Home Depot and Lowe's both have total asset turnovers above the industry average, and they've maintained that for the past 5 years. Flooring and Decor has consistently kept the lowest total asset turnover for all the years that were compared. For profitability, Home Depot has had the highest profitability margin, ROA and ROE, but again, they had the highest equity multiplier, so that's why their ROE is as high as it is, but at the same time, they have a higher profitability margin and ROA, so they're making more money than other people in their industry. Home Depot and Flooring and Decor have profitability margins above the average. Home Depot, Lowe's, and Flooring Decor all have ROAs above the average. A DuPont breakdown revealed that Flooring and Decor had the highest tax burden, Tile Shop had the highest interest burden, and Home Depot had the highest operating margin, total asset turnover, and equity multiplier. For market values, Tile Shop had the highest PE ratio. Home Depot had the highest market book and enterprise value. Home Depot typically had the lowest PE ratio. Beacon typically had the lowest market to book, and Tile Shop had the lowest enterprise value. Tile Shop has the most growth potential, while Beacon should be concerned with being taken over. For cash flows, Home Depot had the highest operating cash flows. They spent the most on capital spending and increasing their net working capital. They had the highest cash flows from assets as well, and they passed on the most to their shareholders. Lowe's also had the second highest operating cash flows, net capital spending, cash flows from assets, and cash flows to shareholders. Beacon passed on more money to creditors than any of its peers. Both Home Depot and Lowe's had negative cash flow to creditors, but they had positive operating cash flows, so they could have paid them more money than they did. Beacon, Tile, and Flooring all had negative cash flows from assets. They invested more than they actually brought in. Both Beacon and Flooring had negative cash flows to shareholders. They increased their equity and they didn't pass on that much to shareholders. For the supply chain, Home Depot and Lowe's had the most suppliers. 136 for Home Depot, 120 for Lowe's, and they shared many of the same suppliers. And their biggest suppliers for Home Depot was Masco Corp. They had cost of goods sold 3.82%. For Lowe's, it was Stanley Black & Decker with cost of goods sold 3.33%. Beacon's biggest supplier was Bridgestone Tire, cost of goods sold 6.95%. But it only had 5 suppliers, so that could leave it at some risk. Flooring, Decor, and Tile Shop did not have any other suppliers listed. And all the companies sell directly to users. Home Depot had the highest NOPAT. They had the highest total invested capital, highest EVA, return on invested capital, and EVA spread. Tile Shop had the lowest NOPAT and the lowest invested capital, so they didn't invest that much. Beacon had the lowest EVA. It was actually negative 100.95 million. They had the lowest return on investment capital and the lowest EVA spread, which was negative 2.59%. So I think the best company in the home improvement industry is definitely going to be Home Depot. Even though their leverage ratios are much higher than their peers, they can afford the debt. And at the same time, they maintain the highest operating margin as well as total asset turnover. They also have adequate liquidity and asset efficiency. They maintain the highest profitability ratios and cash flows. And they've been the industry leader for their cash conversion cycle. So they're really good at bringing in money, turning inventory over, and making a profit. For the automotive parts, the liquidity ratios, Advance had the highest liquidity ratios compared to its peers. Advance and U.S. Auto Parts both have current ratios above the average, which was 1.12. U.S. Auto Parts consistently had the highest cash ratio and quick ratio, and it also had a healthy current ratio as well. So this company seems to be the best at meeting its short-term obligations. AutoZone seems to consistently have the lowest liquidity and struggling the most with these. For solvency, O'Reilly's had the lowest equity multiplier, which we really like. Advance had the second lowest equity multipliers. AutoZone didn't have an equity multiplier because it had negative equity for the past 5 years and even longer actually, because they had basically borrowed a lot of money to increase share price and now they have negative equity. So as a result, debt ratios were compared for all the other companies just to see if they had more debt than the others. And what we found out was Advance consistently had the lowest debt ratios. U.S. Auto Parts and O'Reilly's had low debt ratios. AutoZone and AutoNation had the highest. AutoZone wasn't as high as AutoNation, but they were still definitely high. O'Reilly's consistently had the highest tie ratios. Advance and AutoZone have tie ratios above the average, and U.S. Auto Parts struggled the most. In fact, U.S. Auto Parts often had a negative tie ratio. For asset efficiency, U.S. Auto Parts consistently had the highest total asset turnovers compared to its peers, and they were well above the average. Most of them had 1.2 or 2 point something, but it was definitely not in the threes. And they maintained that for the past 5 years that were compared. AutoNation also had high total asset turnovers. O'Reilly's usually had the lowest. For profitability, AutoZone and O'Reilly's both had the highest profit margin. AutoZone had the highest ROA and O'Reilly's had the highest ROE. The profitability margin, ROA, and ROE are all the lowest for U.S. Auto Parts in all years compared, and they're often negative. A DuPont breakdown showed that AutoZone had the highest tax burden. and second highest operating margin. O'Reilly's had the highest interest burden, operating margin, and ROE. And U.S. Auto Parts had the highest total asset turnover and equity multiplier. Since O'Reilly's equity multiplier is not high, the high ROE is the result of the highest operating margin, which was 19.88%. For the market values, O'Reilly's had the highest PE ratios and market book ratios consistently, except for AutoZone. The problem was they had negative earnings and the whole negative equity thing, so I had to compare their price to sale ratios, and it still showed that O'Reilly's beat its competitors with the highest price to sales ratios. Both AutoZone and O'Reilly's have the highest enterprise value, which are above the industry average. U.S. Auto Parts typically had the lowest enterprise value. For cash flows, AutoZone had the highest operating cash flow and net capital spending, and Advance had the highest spending on net working capital and cash flows to creditors. O'Reilly's had the second highest operating cash flow, highest cash flow from assets, and highest cash flows to their shareholders. AutoZone, AutoNation, and O'Reilly's all had negative cash flows to creditors, while Advance and AutoZone both had negative cash flows to shareholders. U.S. Auto Parts had the lowest operating cash flow, net capital spending, net working capital, cash flows from assets, cash flows from creditors, and cash flows to shareholders. For the supply chain, AutoNation had the highest number of suppliers, which were 19, and they consisted mostly of vehicle manufacturers like Toyota, Ford, GM, places like that. Advance, O'Reilly's, and AutoZone, they shared similar suppliers, and they all sold directly to users. The biggest suppliers for O'Reilly's was Standard Motor Products, with cost of goods sold at 5.51%, and Advance with cost of goods sold 3.59%. AutoZone had Motor Car Parts of America and cost of goods sold 3.44%. U.S. Auto Parts only had 2 suppliers, so that could leave it at a lot of risk. For economic value added, AutoZone had the highest NOPAT, economic value added, return on invested capital, and economic value added spread. Advance had the lowest NOPAT, economic value added, which was actually negative $294.8 million, return on invested capital, and economic value added spread, which was also negative 6.43%. The best company, I think, is O'Reilly's for the automotive parts. Although they have some liquidity issues, I think they do well regarding operating margin, ROE, profitability ratios, cash flows, and maintaining an average level of debt for this type of industry. Also, the company needs to improve its asset efficiency, but otherwise I think it's better compared to its peers. For cosmetics and skincare, the liquidity ratios. Johnson & Johnson consistently had the highest cash ratios and quick ratios. Johnson & Johnson and Estee Lauder generally have current ratios above the industry average, which was generally 1.41. Overall, Johnson & Johnson seems to be the best at meeting its short-term objectives, and Estee Lauder, I put them at second. For solvency, Revlon experienced large losses and they had negative equity, so that caused some problems with comparing. So again, I did debt ratios. Revlon had the highest, a lot higher, at 92.78 for their debt compared to the peers, which the average was 40.35. Johnson & Johnson kept the lowest debt ratios, and all other companies had debt ratios below the industry average. Johnson & Johnson usually kept the highest tie ratios, but Estee Lauder does well in this area too. Revlon consistently had the lowest, and oftentimes it was negative. For asset efficiency, Nu Skin consistently had the highest total asset turnover ratios, while Estee Lauder had the second highest, consistently. Johnson & Johnson had the lowest total asset turnover, for all years compared. So they're definitely having some trouble being efficient with their assets. For profitability, Johnson & Johnson has consistently had the highest profitability margin. Estee Lauder had the highest ROA and ROE for all years compared. Nu Skin typically has profitability margin, ROA, and ROEs above the industry average. ROE was missing for Revlon, but the company had the lowest profitability margin and ROA ratios. A DuPont breakdown, which did not include Revlon due to they didn't have equity multiplier, but for all the other companies, Coty Cosmetics had the highest tax burden and equity multiplier. Johnson & Johnson had the highest interest burden and operating margin. Nu Skin had the highest total asset turnover, and Estee Lauder had the second highest operating margin and total asset turnover. And Johnson & Johnson had the lowest equity multiplier. For market values, Coty Cosmetics had the highest PE ratios and market to book. This company has the highest growth potential, I think. Price to sales were also compared due to the problems with Revlon again. Revlon still had the lowest price to sale ratios, and Coty Cosmetics had the highest. In terms of enterprise value, Estee Lauder typically maintained the highest enterprise value, and Johnson & Johnson had second highest. For cash flows, Johnson & Johnson had the highest, a lot higher, operating cash flows, net capital spending, net working capital, cash flows from assets, and they passed on the most to their shareholders. But, however, their cash flow to creditors was negative because they kept increasing a lot more borrowings, and then they paid interest expense. But because they had so much extra cash, I think they could have paid them more. Coty Cosmetics and Nu Skin both had negative cash flow to creditors as well. Revlon and Coty Cosmetics both had negative cash flows to shareholders. Coty, Nu Skin, and Revlon all had negative cash flows to assets because Coty and Nu Skin, they spent a lot more on capital than they brought in. And Revlon had large losses and all kind of other issues. Coty Cosmetics had the second highest operating cash flow, and Estee Lauder had the second highest cash flows from assets. For the supply chain, Johnson & Johnson has many suppliers compared to its peers, and its biggest supplier is General Electric, and they have cost of goods sold 3.69%. This company shares many of the same customers as Revlon and Coty Cosmetics. Coty and Revlon earn most of their revenue from Walmart. Estee Lauder sells to higher-end brands and department stores, unlike its peers like Macy's, Nordstrom, places like that. And Nu Skin sells directly to customers, but only has 2 suppliers, so that could leave them at a lot of risk. Revlon only had 5 suppliers, so they could be at risk as well. And that was a lot lower than the others in their industry. For EVA, Johnson & Johnson had the highest NOPAT and invested capital. So they spent a lot of money on invested capital, and Estee Lauder had the highest EVA. Nu Skin had the highest return on invested capital and EVA spread. I think for the best company for this industry would be Estee Lauder. Even though Johnson & Johnson passed them up in a lot of different areas, some would say that it's not fair to compare them because Johnson & Johnson sells a lot of different products, where Estee Lauder doesn't sell that many. Sure, they have lotions and perfumes and different things like that, but they don't sell as many different kinds of products as Johnson & Johnson. So, looking at that and looking at the others in the industry, they had the second highest operating margin, healthy profitability ratios, great liquidity ratios, low level of debt, higher than average asset efficiency ratios, highest ROA, highest ROE, and EVA. I think the best company overall has got to be Home Depot. Even though there were other companies that may have had higher operating margins and total asset turnovers at times, they maintained higher operating margins and asset turnover over the past 5 years consistently, whereas the other companies, it was kind of up and down. And they did have a lot of leverage, but at the same time, they still had higher operating margins and total asset turnovers and cash flows, cash conversion cycles than their peers and the others in the other industries. So I definitely think they were the best, and thank you.